Welcome everybody. Today I'm so excited to have a guest like Noah Healy today with me, a very experienced public speaker and a recreational mathematician. So welcome Noah.
Thanks for having me here, Antonis.
Amazing. Do you want to tell us more about yourself, who you are, and what you do?
Absolutely. So I am interested in exploring computational mathematics. So I mostly do algorithm development. And one of the algorithms that I've developed is a upgraded system for operating commodity markets, a way to take the existing buyer-seller paradigm and turn it into a four-player game of an operator, a producer, a negotiator, and a consumer that would allow our economic systems to be more stable and less expensive.
Less expensive. Okay, that's interesting. So before we get into the details of that marketplace, because that sounds really interesting to me. What about you? What's your background like?
Well, I was born and raised in a university town called Charlottesville, Virginia. And I'm a pretty good fit for the space because I basically like reading and natural spaces. And this is a fairly nice temperate part of the world most of the time. And there's a lot of books floating around.
Right, that's interesting. So, in terms of the superior form of marketplace, how did you discover that exactly?
I was working on my understanding of communication theory and working towards developing new consensus algorithms. And I found a novel approach in that space and had this insight that it could be used to build a marketplace. And so essentially as a challenge, I decided to build a marketplace using the approach mostly just to, have the intellectual pleasure of doing that, but also as a potential validation for the approach, because markets are known to work exceptionally well. And so if this approach produced something that worked about as well as existing markets, then that would make it a very excellent approach. It turns out that it actually reveals that existing markets actually don't work all that well, mostly because of recent advances in communication and control thanks to the computer revolution, and that in fact this works considerably better than they do.
Okay, interesting. So in terms, when you said that some markets doesn't work that well, is there an example we can relate to here?
Yeah, so if you take a look at the economic breakdown of different countries and sort of look at one of those pie chart things of which sectors of the economy are growing and shrinking, what you'll see over the last half century-ish at this point, financial services have been continually growing as a share of the economy. And that actually doesn't make any sense. Financial services are fundamentally an information service, and computers do information processing for us. And so computers have been, in terms of their information capacity and processing abilities, improving exponentially over the last century almost at this point. And so if you had an information service that was functioning and you had a exponentially declining cost system for doing, information services, you would expect the costs of those information services to also decline exponentially. And what we're actually seeing is that they are growing over time. So that's basically the unanswerable indictment for the system at hand.
Okay, that sounds good. That sounds like a good example. So, did someone inspire you to go down that certain path that you've chosen?
Sort of. So
Mm-hmm.
when I first came up with the approach and was sort of happy about coming up with a new idea, I
Right.
went over to the guy who was my neighbor at the time to tell
Okay.
him about what I was working on, and he asked me whether or not I could use that in the marketplaces, and that's what got me thinking about the process. And sort of after I left his house and was walking back to my house, I had this kind of insight that it wouldn't be applied to the markets as they are, but there could be a way to apply the approach to create a marketplace, and so that gave me my next interesting problem to think about.
That's really nice. It's a really nice thing to say. So so what's exactly that formal marketplace? I know it should have many details and all that stuff, but do you think we can explain that in a simple way so everybody can understand it?
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
the core thing to understand is that the roles in the marketplace are roles. So single individuals can be in more than one role.
Okay.
Um, but we can also think of the roles as sort of super individuals. So what you have is lots and lots of individual suppliers, but they're all being rolled up by the system into sort of one mega supplier. And so there's one
Right.
mega supplier, negotiator, and consumer. So what happens is the negotiator sort of fights it out among themselves, and they work out what the price ought to be today and next week and so on. And
Yeah.
then they propose these prices to the producers and consumers, who then decide how much they want to partake. So imagine you had two people that needed to make a deal,
Yeah.
and not just two individuals, but sort of two mega groups, like an industry in one country and an industry in another country.
Yeah.
The deal is kind of like a tug of war. They don't want
Mm-hmm.
to pull so hard they pull it apart, but they would each like to pull it over to where their side or the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they're equally strong, it'll meet in the middle somewhere. But the trick is there's somewhere that actually maximizes the total value economically of what's going on. So what the
Mm-hmm.
negotiator is doing is saying, okay, you guys don't have to spend all this time struggling with each other. We'll do that internally. I'll just sort of get a platter and put it out where I think the deal is going to wind up. And then you guys can just put on that at the end. And so
Mm-hmm.
you wind up with this situation where at the high level, it's all cooperative. The negotiator knows everything because everybody, puts on their negotiator hat and fights that out.
Yeah.
Tells everybody what everybody knows, and then the producers and consumers just trade in this environment where all the information's been transparent. It's all been negotiated and litigated out, and they just trade as much as they can profitably make or use.
Okay. So from what I understand, if we have, the big main businesses, let's say, in real life, is that linked with that the bigger businesses are gonna take with them the smaller businesses and then make a price and a service based on what the big businesses, the big names think?
So what this actually does is it effectively creates a business that's bigger than any of the businesses in the system.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so what winds up happening is the little guys wind up getting the same deal as the big guys, which is the deal that this sort of ultimate huge guy is negotiating for itself. And
Mm-hmm.
we actually do is we fill these orders bottom up. And so the little guys are taking on less risk proportionally because they're
Okay.
less able to take on risk. And the big guys are taking on the risks essentially. So in order to be big in this system, you need to be more efficient than the little guys are. You can't
Mm.
just use your economic clout to force, other people to take worse deals so that you can be
Yeah.
large.
I see. So it's basically that form of marketplace is basically giving a chance to the small businesses to actually take less risk and grow. correct?
Exactly. Well, the value proposition of an open market space is to have very large numbers of participants on each side. That's where
Mm-hmm.
the risk spreading and diversification comes from.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an agreement with a local farm to deliver food to you and you get all of your food from there, then that's great. But if the
Yeah.
farmer has a heart attack or their truck breaks down, or you decide that you don't like broccoli and pork and that's what they grow there, then you're kind of behind the eight ball at that point.
Yeah.
um, but if you can arrange that basically every farmer on earth is providing their goods to a common source that you are then one of the
Mm-hmm.
joint users of, then any one specific farmer that's doing something that doesn't work out so much has no effect on whether or not you're going to have steak and cereal,
Yeah.
because somebody else will.
Yeah, I see. So, in reality, let's say we have the more competition we have in a market, the less the cost or a decrease, the cost decreases over time. The more the competition, the less the cost. So is that still the case with that form of marketplace?
Well, the thing that's curious about this is that the competition is going in both directions. So as
Okay.
more people enter onto the supply side and become producers, that will moderate costs and cause them to come down. But as more people enter the buy side and become consumers, that also produces a competitive action, but one that pushes prices upwards. So um, the the ultimate fate of prices is dependent on the combination of how much we can improve productivity and how much we can improve the value of consumption. And
Mhm.
that's going to be a very complicated and path dependent question. So I don't really know. the
Yeah.
the immediate effect of adopting this technology I call coordinated discovery markets, or
Hmm.
CDM,
Yeah.
is that prices will be relatively stable for consumers, because the amount that consumers currently pay causes them to want the amount of stuff they currently want, which is
Hmm.
roughly the correct amount to sort of do. But with the markets dramatically dropping their transaction costs, that will result in producers getting a spike in
Oh, okay.
revenue, and a
Hmm.
considerable spike in profits. And so that should, in the medium term, encourage a lot more people to get into production in those marketplaces, which would then expand supplies and start moderating prices, which then, in the sort of medium to long term, creates a lot of new inventive opportunities as it becomes less expensive to acquire, lumber or energy or food or whatever. New and creative ideas can be tried out to find ways to find value for those products.
I see. That's interesting. So it's basically increasing cost but increasing profit, and then we basically make the marketplace stronger. That's what it looks like.
Well, yeah, and there's historical precedent for this. With the introduction of the kinds of markets that we use today, um, we see a similar kind of thing happen in the Mediterranean, where the
Okay.
economic center of gravity of the Mediterranean shifted from, at that point, the Byzantine Empire, which, having control of the Bosphorus,
Mm-hmm.
had the most important markets in the world. But
Mm-hmm.
as the northern Italian city-states developed this particular technology and started opening up marketplaces and opening up negotiation, which had not previously been a thing,
Mm-hmm.
um, that meant that better pricing led to wider trade and more innovation. And so that's one of the things that drove the improvements in ship design and navigation that ultimately led to global exploration, and opening up the new world to the Europeans, and
Mm-hmm.
basically all of modern history.
All right. So that's similar with what we are talking about now then, and it's been practiced, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm.
It's the probable primary cause of the Renaissance. It's not
Okay.
like the people in Venice and Naples just woke up one day and said, "Hey, let's build a lot of marble statues because we feel like it." Um, as they suddenly became the economic center of gravity, they suddenly went from effectively goat herders to being the richest people on earth, and they decided to use their wealth to celebrate their wealth. And one of the things that they did was look into a lot of history and try to revive the Roman Empire to
Mm-hmm.
associate themselves with that legacy rather than their legacy as goat herders. and
Yeah.
uh, and so that's where the that kind of Renaissance architecture gets explosion. And then once you're
Mhm.
putting that kind of money in the pockets of craftsmen and artisans, they started the study in mathematics to improve their architecture, and started having a
Mhm.
lot more aesthetic desirability and so on. And that's where we
Mhm.
get this sort of wonderful flourishing.
All right. So is that a case in the big powerful nations like USA, UK, Russia, maybe?
Absolutely, yes.
Mhm.
Uh, New York is a sort of world renowned theater destination,
Yeah.
and Wall Street is there. That's not a
Mhm.
coincidence. The
Mm.
reason it's a world renowned theater, you know, isn't because traders were so attracted by the ability to go to plays on weekends that they just
Yeah.
had to trade there. It's that with the richest people on earth in attendance, it was possible to finance these very lavish and very, high scale productions, which were
Mm.
then of high import. The same thing happens in London, for example.
Mhm.
uh, and we see this replicated. Amsterdam it has a very famous architectural set that was essentially put together in the 15 and 1600s, at the
Mhm.
time when Spain was using them as their deep water port for the treasure fleets, and they became
Okay.
the financial center of gravity of all of Europe. And so, once again, just as the Italians had, they invested in art, invested in architecture, and built up this entire culture around wealth, and
Mhm.
became important centers of art and travel and everything else at the same time. Uh, so we see this pattern, today. We see this pattern in
Yeah.
history. Uh, uh, the Hong Kong action cinema would be significantly less important if Hong Kong was a landlocked system where nobody could get anywhere. But by combining one of the world's most active ports with the sort of desperation for having an outlet,
Mhm.
they created several innovative cinema things that are now part of the general lexicon, and we understand, that action ought to look like what they figured out action ought to look like, and so on.
Yeah. I see. Do we still need time to move to that superior form of marketplace worldwide, or it's already there for us?
Well, it's a matter of doing it at this point. So the adoption of a new market structure is generally a snowball. It's
Okay.
it's hard to get started, but once you're going, the
Mm.
users are benefiting so much that they attract other people.
Mm.
And so, uh, in terms of getting it to be global, the problem isn't so much building a brand new, billion-dollar piece of infrastructure. It's
Mm.
getting small groups to come together and use this technology, benefit from it, and then just as in these other examples, use that benefit to better themselves in ways that will then, hey, other people will notice. You know, those northern Italians used to be living in, you know, grass hovels, and
Yeah.
now they're living in marble piazzas. What do we need to do to get some marble piazzas? Like that's really awesome.
I see. Right. So, what do you think is the next step from where we are now to what you just described in worldwide superior formal marketplace?
Well, like I said, I am looking around. There's a handful of people around the world that are attempting to set up markets that incorporate the technology, and I'm always looking for others. I also have started a petition. The US
Okay.
Patent Office is behaving very weirdly around this whole thing, and so there's a petition up on change.org. And if somebody just listens to this and would like to, you know, offer a little bit of support,
Yeah.
signing is really useful, actually. And we just passed, let's see, we just passed milestone number 5 on change.org. So that's been up for about 3 weeks, and it's still growing exponentially. So I'm pretty happy about it.
Okay, that's good to know as well. Is there a link for that? I guess there is.
Yeah. I will give it to you, but it
Cool.
is change.org/all caps CDM _, all lowercase patent.
Yeah, there'll be in the description as well for them to go and sign up to do whatever with that. Okay, that's cool. So, right, to get to a bonus section now, you will describe what I say in one word based on the first thought that comes to your mind. That's a bit of a fun section, yeah?
Okay.
After we've done that. So, are you ready?
Absolutely.
Building the pressure as always. So, marketplace.
Intelligence.
Better world.
Utopia.
Inspiration.
It's already one word. Intuition.
Impossible.
Paradox.
Mathematics.
Beauty.
Economy breakdown.
Today.
I'm sure we need to elaborate on that, don't you think?
Well, I mean, it's sort of all around us.
That's true.
We just saw Google apparently lost $70 billion in stock value thanks to releasing what is in actual fact the world's most powerful generative AI that they very specifically decided to cripple in the production. So Gemini supposedly has a 1 million token analysis window. And to put this in context, GPT-4, I believe, is in the mid tens of thousands somewhere, like 50, 60. So if Gemini actually worked, it would represent a 20-ish fold advance in the scale of what was possible. So like imagine somebody releasing a jumbo jet that carried 6,000 passengers, except it just always crashed. Like that's it's just unbelievably stupid that the amount of effort they put into doing the wrong thing. This is something that we're seeing replicated across multiple industries in many ways. There was an example. I first found out about this several years ago, but I was just brought it up last week to a friend. Natural blueberries. That's the kind of blueberries that get frozen. Blueberries are raised all over the world, but the frozen blueberries are basically just raised in the American Northeast and Canadian Southeast. And because they're essentially all frozen, there's a handful of companies that are the only buyers in this marketplace. And so they every year go through some sort of process and decide what the value of the entire crop is. And then just kind of bid out based on that. So there's not really a market. It's just a fixed set of buyers, and they just decide how much it is. So from like roughly 1990, like late 90s through mid 2010s, the technological process allowed yields to go up by a factor of 10. So the size of the crop was 10 times what it had been 15 years earlier. The total value of the crop increased by 0 pennies. The number they came up with every year was the same number. And the farmers were making more and more and more and getting paid lower and lower unit costs the whole way along. And this is happening. You see the farmer protests in Europe. They're getting pushed to the wall. The markets, as they're presently designed, are designed to push them to the wall, and the computers are making them very efficient at doing that. That's also happening on the consumer side. It looks like lifestyle maintenance might be the leading issue in this year's presidential election. And once again, markets as they're presently constituted are designed to make that as difficult as possible, and computers are making them better and better able to do that. So we're seeing this all over the place. It's bleeding into politics, it's bleeding into culture. We need to fix it, and I have a candidate solution.
And this is great. I think this is the right spot. And this was Noah Healy, ladies and gentlemen.